Hello there and welcome to Old Testament Foundations, Module number 12. This week we move on to look at the rise of the kings in Israel. Last week, of course, we were looking at the book of Judges, and the book of Judges ends on a most disheartening note as we read that Israel at that time had no king and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But as we move into the book of 1 and 2 Samuel, we begin to see God's calling and appointment of this man named Samuel, called at such a young age, called to be a man who would have a pivotal role in the ongoing unfolding plan of God's redemption, which would be ultimately fulfilled through the nation of Israel. We see that Samuel at such a young age was set apart to God. As he grew up, he exercised not only a priestly function, but he also exercised the function of a prophet and the function of a judge. Indeed, he was the last of the great judges of Israel before they would finally have an earthly king. When we come to 1 Samuel chapter 8, we read of the time in which the people came to Samuel, demanding that he should provide for them a king, an earthly king that they could see with their own eyes. Of course, God himself was to be the king over his people. This was to be a theocracy where the people recognized that God himself, the sovereign Lord of all creation, was the God of his people Israel. But they wanted a king that they could see. And so in accordance with the promises and the provisions that God had made right back in Deuteronomy, Samuel finally conceded to give them a king. A king, of course, that God would appoint over the people. Samuel anoints Saul to become the very first king over Israel. And Saul's role in many ways was to be the vice-regent, not the ultimate king, but the one who would serve under the ultimate king, who was God himself. Saul, as we will shortly see as we continue our studies in 1 Samuel, made a fabulous beginning. And yet it wasn't long before his heart began to fill with pride, and that pride became his undoing. We see Saul on occasions seeking to usurp the role of the priests, in his arrogance, thinking that he was the king and he could do just whatever he pleased. We see him also willfully disobeying the clear instructions that God had provided for him. And so ultimately we hear God's heart, where God says that he has rejected Saul, and he will replace him with a man who is a man after his own heart. And so Samuel is sent yet again to anoint yet another king of Israel, this time to the house of Jesse, where he comes and he anoints David to become king over Israel. We'll see something of that exciting story as David begins to mature, a young man, a young shepherd, but a man upon whose hand God has clearly rested. And we see David as he begins to serve in the royal courts, firstly providing music to appease the tormented spirit of the aging King Saul. But not only that, we see that God is equipping him and preparing him for the great task of leading the nation of Israel. Finally, after the death of Saul and his son Jonathan at a horrendous battle, we find that David becomes king over Israel. It is a rather protracted and drawn-out process, but when David does become king, Israel enters into what many regard as the golden age of the nation of Israel. These were exciting times of not only economic prosperity, but times in which there was peace largely amongst the people of God, where in many ways the enemies that they did confront, they would drive back with the power of God. David, in fact, drives the Jebusites out of the city of Jerusalem and reclaims that city to become the very capital of the city of Israel. It is a glorious time in which David functions as king over Israel. And yet sadly, as he gets older, we see that David then begins to make some very foolish and unwise calls. Most notable of all of these, of course, is David's dreadful sin of adultery with Bathsheba. It is a dreadful chapter in the ongoing story of this man who was called the man after God's own heart. Not only does David engage in the sin of adultery, but further to that, he actually arranges for the execution, really, of Bathsheba's husband, Uriah the Hittite, arranging that Uriah should be placed in the hottest part of the battle when David's men went out to war. And of course, in the process, Uriah was killed. But technically, one would have to say that David was responsible for his death, a death which was tantamount to murder. David, in fact, seems to think that he's covered his tracks well in this regard, until he is found out. And God exposes his sin, and David becomes a man who is utterly broken over his sin. And out of that brokenness comes the incredible words of Psalm 51. Oh, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew within me a right spirit. David confesses, Lord, against you and you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight. Psalm 51 is one of the most extraordinary psalms of confession and repentance that we have. Many of us, I'm sure, have used the words of these self-same psalms to reflect our heart of brokenness and repentance before God. And so we will chase the journey of King David, a man truly, yes, with feet of clay, but ultimately still a man whose heart's orientation was fundamentally to be a heart after God. Well, I trust that you will find great encouragement and challenge as you take this journey with us into 1 and 2 Samuel. May God bless you.